Have you ever stopped to think about the mysteries that the future may reveal? Today, we will explore 7 powerful prophecies that not only change the way we understand the present, but also shed light on the path ahead of us. Each of these revelations brings profound insights and can transform the way you see the world. And the best part? The last prophecy holds a challenge that few can accomplish. So stick with me until the end, because this journey could be the key to something extraordinary that you have yet to discover. The great eagle of Ezra and the ascending empire. Ezra, in his vision, is confronted by an immense and powerful creature, an eagle that rises from the ocean, an impressive vision of strength and authority, with 3 heads and 2 immense wings. This eagle carries within it the destiny of an empire that will dominate the world. Its feathers, carefully detailed in the vision, are not mere adornments, but represent leaders who, one by one, will govern this vast empire. The eagle symbolizes a powerful nation, and the feathers, both long and short, indicate the passage of time, the succession of power, and the events that will shape the future of this kingdom. On the right wing of the eagle, Ezra sees 14 feathers, 12 of which are long and 2 are short. Each of these feathers represents a leader who will rise to power in this global empire. The long feathers symbolize those leaders who will have more stable mandates, lasting longer, and leading the nation during periods of apparent tranquility. However, among these feathers, 2 are short, indicating leaders whose administrations will be interrupted by external forces. The interruption of these mandates will not be by mere chance. Something profound, hidden in the shadows, will work to bring down these leaders before they can complete their plans. The empire will be tested in these moments, as the lack of continuity will create a crisis that will echo throughout the nation. Ezra is instructed by the angel guiding him in the vision to pay special attention to the second of the short feathers. When this second short feather appears, it will indicate that the empire is entering a decisive moment in its history. The angel explains that the second short feather represents a turning point, a milestone that divides the time of the empire into 2 parts. The first half will be marked by a certain stability, where the leaders will follow a more predictable path, but the second half will be one of complete uncertainty. The interruption of the mandate of the leader corresponding to this second short feather will be a warning that significant changes are coming, and that the empire will enter a phase of rapid and inevitable decline. Hidden forces, which have already been operating behind the scenes, will gain even more power, manipulating events to lead the empire to its ultimate collapse. The last of the long feathers, also located on the right wing, marks the rise of the last powerful leader of this empire. This will be a leader who takes control amid chaos, attempting to restore order in an empire that is clearly in decline. He will face a series of internal crises, many of them the result of a system corrupted by hidden interests and the infiltration of malevolent forces. This leader will be seen as the last hope for the recovery of the empire, and for a time, it may even seem that he will manage to stabilize the nation. However, his leadership will be continually undermined by political intrigue, secret manipulations, and enemies acting in the shadows. His mandate, although prolonged compared to others, will not bring the salvation that many hope for. Instead, it will be the prelude to an inevitable collapse. This leader will face opposition both internally and externally, and his attempts to maintain control will be in vain. The empire, which was once a symbol of power and stability, will begin to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. The eagle, with its long and short feathers, reveals that even the greatest empires are subject to the forces of fate, and that the downfall of powerful leaders is merely the beginning of a larger decline process. This vision of the eagle from Ezra brings to light the unrelenting cycle of power and fall that defines the trajectory of great nations. The empire represented by the eagle, with its leaders symbolized by the feathers, shows that no matter how strong a kingdom becomes, it will always be vulnerable to the forces that operate in the shadows, and that the rise to power is only the beginning of the inevitable fall. Each leader, represented by these feathers, has a role to play, but all are subject to the fate that Ezra's vision reveals. These three sub-prophecies present a clear picture. The empire represented by Ezra's eagle is not destined to last forever. Its leaders, though powerful, face challenges they cannot control. And just as the eagle's feathers follow one another, the leaders of this empire will also fall, one by one, until the cycle of destruction is complete. The eagle may seem invincible, but even it is subject to the inevitability of decline. The first prophecy revealed how the great eagle rose to power and how each of its leaders represented a step on the path of its fall. But what many do not realize is that we are living through similar moments today, where the signs are already fulfilling before our eyes. To help you better understand these mysteries, I have made exclusive material available in the first pinned comment. There are very few units, so download it now and discover what more these prophecies reveal about the future. And in the next prophecy, we will see how the empire begins to crumble from within. The internal collapse and division of the empire. As Ezra's vision unfolds, the great eagle, symbol of the empire, begins to show signs of weakness. The second prophecy reveals that the empire will enter a period of deep internal division, marked by conflicts between factions vying for control. The three heads of the eagle, once hidden, now begin to awaken and directly influence the nation's destiny. These heads represent corruption, chaos, and destruction that slowly erode the foundation of the empire. Ezra observes, with growing unease, the moment when the three heads of the eagle awaken. Until this point, these heads remained inert, but now they stir, signaling that the time of stability is over. These heads represent three internal forces that will begin to vie for power within the empire. The first head, that of corruption, symbolizes the infiltration of hidden interests that take advantage of power structures. This head will begin to corrode the empire from the inside, using treacherous methods and manipulating the most important decisions for its benefit. The second head, that of chaos, manifests as internal division, where rival power groups will attempt to overthrow each other, fragmenting the unity of the empire. The third head, that of destruction, will bring final ruin, representing the point at which the empire can no longer sustain itself. As the eagle's heads awaken, the creature's wings enter into conflict. The vision reveals that the two wings, which once maintained the balance of the empire, now become adversaries. The right wing, representing traditional leadership and conservative forces, seeks to maintain control and preserve the established order. However, the left wing, which symbolizes the emerging new forces, begins to contest this dominance, proposing radical changes and challenging the existing structure. This battle between the wings brings the empire to a state of political paralysis. The institutions begin to fragment, and decisions are made amid chaos and a lack of consensus. The empire, which was once strong and unified, now finds itself torn apart by an internal war that affects not only its leaders, but also the population itself. The third sub-prophecy of this vision shows the complete collapse of the unity that sustained the empire. The three heads of the eagle, which are now in full activity, not only fight among themselves for control, but also work to completely destabilize the governmental structure. The first head of corruption begins to dominate a large part of the institutions, corrupting them irreversibly. The second head of chaos deepens the disunity, creating rival factions that fight for power. The third head of destruction begins to act directly, dismantling what remains of the internal cohesion of the empire. The feathers representing the leaders of the empire begin to fall rapidly. The pace of leadership succession accelerates, with presidents being ousted or resigning before completing their terms. The hidden forces that once operated in the shadows are now in plain sight, and the bewildered public watches the collapse of their institutions without knowing how to react. Power, which was once in the hands of stable leaders, is now contested amid chaos, with no one able to maintain control for long. These three sub-prophecies point to a period of great internal convulsion in the empire. The awakening of the three heads and the conflict between the wings reveal that the political system is fractured beyond the point of recovery. The leadership, which once kept the empire united, is now in ruins, and the very structure of government is on the verge of collapse. Corruption, chaos, and destruction are no longer distant threats, but present realities that directly affect the empire's fate. This second prophecy shows us that, no matter how powerful an empire may seem, it is always vulnerable to the internal forces that, over time, erode its foundation. The division between rival factions, endemic corruption, and the inability to maintain order bring the empire to the brink of collapse. The awakening of the eagle's heads is not just a symbol of a power shift, but a warning that the end is near. The leaders who emerge after this moment will have little or no ability to restore unity, and the empire will be doomed to an era of continuous decline. Thus we see that the empire, represented by Ezra's eagle, is on an irreversible path. Corruption, chaos, and destruction now govern events, and the future looks bleak. The battle between the wings and the awakening of the heads reveal that the collapse is not a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. The empire that once dominated the world is now on the verge of unraveling, with its leaders unable to stem the tide of destruction that is approaching. External intervention and the rise of new powers. In the continuation of Ezra's vision, the great eagle, already weakened by internal conflicts, now faces new threats from outside. The third prophecy reveals that while the empire is engulfed in its own ruin, external forces take advantage of this weakness to intervene and attempt to take control. The collapse that was once purely internal now expands, with external enemies pressing on the empire's borders. These new powers present themselves in an organized manner, with defined strategies and, unlike the internal heads of the eagle, are focused on completely overthrowing what remains of the corrupt leadership. Ezra sees that while the heads of the eagle fight among themselves for control, external forces begin to mobilize against the empire. These enemies are represented by smaller birds of prey, watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to strike. They are not interested in ruling the empire, but in destroying its global influence. Taking advantage of the internal division and chaos, these enemies begin to invade the fringes of the empire, testing the already weakened defenses. Small confrontations turn into larger invasions, and the empire finds itself unable to maintain order both inside and outside its borders. These enemies are determined and relentless, and they see the weakness of the empire as an opportunity to rise as new regional powers. As the external enemies advance, the empire's defenses begin to crumble. The eagle, once invincible, now seems incapable of reacting. Ezra's vision shows that the military and diplomatic defenses of the empire, which once guaranteed its supremacy, are rapidly weakening. The alliance system that sustained the eagle's power begins to unravel, and old allies drift away, seeking their own survival. The internal leadership, still divided and consumed by corruption, is unable to organize an effective response. The heads of the eagle continue to fight among themselves, while the wings remain in conflict, preventing any coordinated action. The external forces see this as a sign of irreversible weakness and intensify their attacks, forcing the empire to retreat even further into its borders. With the collapse of the empire's defenses, new regional powers begin to emerge. Ezra observes that these new forces, previously subservient to the eagle's power, now take control of strategic regions that once belonged to the empire. These new powers are not interested in restoring the old order, but rather in creating their own spheres of influence. They see the eagle's collapse as an opportunity to rewrite the rules, to establish a new world order that no longer depends on the ancient empire. This process is swift and decisive, with new leaders emerging from the shadows to fill the power vacuum left by the weakened empire. These new leaders, unlike those who made up the old empire, have a clear vision of dominance and expansion. They are not interested in maintaining the status quo, but in consolidating their own realms. The eagle, which once dominated the world, now finds itself surrounded by rival powers that refuse to recognize its authority. These new powers begin to define the rules of a new global political game, and the empire, once the center of power, is now just one more player among many, struggling for survival. This third prophecy serves as a warning that when an empire weakens from within, outside enemies inevitably take advantage of the situation. Internal weakness is seen as an opportunity for new forces to take control, and what was once considered unshakable is now at the mercy of enemies that, until then, were irrelevant on the global stage. The eagle, symbol of a once dominant empire, now faces a reality where its very survival is threatened. The sub-prophecies of this vision show that the decline of an empire is rarely an isolated process. Internal weakness always attracts external forces, and when defenses begin to crumble, the path is cleared for others to take their place. These new regional powers are a direct threat to the established order, and their rise marks the beginning of a new era where the old hegemony no longer has space. The eagle, once a symbol of strength and unity, is now a fragmented empire, unable to defend itself against its internal and external enemies. The empire, which once dictated the rules, now finds itself vulnerable and powerless in the face of new powers that are unafraid to challenge its authority. The fate of the eagle is sealed, and the new leaders emerging from the ruins of the former empire are ready to establish their own rules. What was once a great world power transforms into a shadow of what it was, and Ezra's vision shows that the complete ruin of the empire is increasingly near. Now that we've seen how external enemies began to invade while the empire crumbled from within, tell me in the comments, had you heard of these three prophecies before? Did you know that these events are reflected in the times we are living in? I want to know your opinion. But don't leave yet, because the fourth prophecy brings something even more shocking: the final judgment of the heads of the eagle and the total collapse of the ancient order. Stay until the end, because the last prophecy reserves a challenge that few can complete. The final judgment and the end of the ancient order, Ezra's fourth prophecy, reveals the moment when the empire finally faces its judgment. The heads of the eagle, now in total chaos, begin the final process of destruction. This prophecy brings to light the inevitable confrontation between the forces that once dominated the world and the rise of a new order. The empire, now just a shadow of what it was, faces its final test, where every decision made could either hasten or delay the final collapse. The judgment of the heads of the eagle approaches, and the end of the ancient order is about to happen. The three heads of the eagle, which once symbolized control and power, now turn against each other. Ezra observes that these heads, instead of uniting forces to try to save the empire, enter into a destructive dispute that leads to total ruin. The first head, of corruption, is consumed by intrigue and betrayal, while the second head, of chaos, is overwhelmed by disorganization and a lack of clear leadership. The third head, of destruction, finally begins to act more directly, accelerating the fall of the empire. The conflict between these heads reaches a breaking point, and what was once a battle for control now becomes a war for survival. The empire begins to rapidly disintegrate, with each head trying to seize what remains of power, but in reality accelerating the process of destruction even further. At this point in the vision, Ezra sees that the judgment is not limited only to the heads of the eagle. The leaders who were part of the empire, represented by the feathers, also face their judgment. Those who led the nation into chaos are now confronted with the consequences of their actions. The short feathers, which represent the leaders whose mandates were interrupted, are judged for their inability to maintain control. Leaders who had longer mandates are also called to account, and all of them, without exception, are held responsible for the empire's collapse. The judgment is not merely symbolic, but literal, with direct consequences for each individual involved. The actions of corruption, betrayal, and negligence are brought to light, and the truth about each leader's role in the collapse becomes clear. The destruction of the empire was not caused solely by external forces, but primarily by a lack of leadership and internal corruption. With the judgment of the heads and the feathers concluded, Ezra sees the emergence of a new order. The empire that once dominated the world is now in ruins, and its structures of power have been completely dismantled. However, from the ashes of this empire rises a new force, one that is not interested in restoring the old order, but in creating something completely new. This new order is made up of leaders who have learned from the mistakes of the past and are determined not to repeat the same paths of corruption and destruction. These new leaders do not have the global ambitions that the old empire had, but are focused on building a power structure based on cooperation and balance. The Empire of the Eagle, which once was a symbol of oppression and dominance, now gives way to a new era of balance and rebuilding. Ezra watches this transition closely, and what once seemed to be an absolute end now transforms into a new beginning. The new order rising from the ashes of the Eagle Empire is not perfect, but it is grounded in principles different from those that led the empire to collapse. The old order, which was governed by greed and the relentless pursuit of power, is now replaced by a new, more modest vision, but also more stable. The new leaders, although not perfect, bring with them the promise of a fairer and less corrupt future. This fourth prophecy shows us that even after the collapse of an empire, there is always the possibility of rebirth. Destruction is not the end, but a prelude to a new era. The forces that brought down the old empire are now being replaced by new ideas and new leaders who are willing to learn from the past and to avoid the mistakes that led to the eagle's fall. The judgment of the heads and the feathers is a necessary step for the new order to be established, and the end of the old order paves the way for the emergence of something new. This prophecy is a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to collapse. When corruption and lack of leadership take over, the empire's fate is sealed. However, there is always an opportunity for rebirth, and the new order that rises from the ruins of the Eagle Empire brings with it the hope that a new path can be forged. The empire may have fallen, but the future can still be shaped by those willing to learn from the mistakes of the past. The end of illusions and the revelation of true forces. The fifth prophecy reveals a new stage in Ezra's vision, where the illusions that sustain the empire finally dissolve. Until this moment, many of the forces that operated behind the scenes were hidden, working silently and influencing the course of events without being perceived by the majority. But now, in the fall of the empire, everything is revealed. The true forces that manipulated and controlled the eagle's fate are exposed, and the previously deceived population finally understands what was behind the chaos and destruction. This revelation is shocking, as it shows that the collapse of the empire was not just a matter of internal weakness, but the result of a carefully orchestrated manipulation by hidden powers. In the first sub-prophecy, Ezra sees that the forces that were once hidden are now brought to light. The masks covering the intentions of various leaders fall, and their true agendas are exposed. Corruption was not an accident, but part of a carefully crafted plan by a group of elites who, for centuries, controlled the actions of the empire. These forces were not just internal, but also involved external influences, with secret alliances that went far beyond the empire's borders. The fall of the eagle reveals that many of the leaders who seemed to be in control were, in fact, puppets in the hands of greater powers. These powers, now revealed, have nothing left to hide, and the people finally see the true dimensions of the forces that have worked against the empire from the very beginning. The second sub-prophecy of this vision brings to light the presence of the deep state, a hidden force that manipulated events in the empire for decades, if not centuries. Ezra sees that the deep state operated as a network of political, business, and military elites who, over time, infiltrated power structures. corroding them from within. The deep state was not a conspiracy of a few individuals, but a complex and entrenched system, created to ensure that power always remained in the hands of a few, regardless of who was publicly at the helm of the empire. This revelation shakes the people's trust, as they realize that the leadership they believed was in charge was merely a puppet of this larger system. The influence of the deep state was decisive in the collapse of the eagle, and its exposure finally brings to light the true cause of the empire's fall. In the third sub-prophecy, the revelation of the hidden forces provokes a revolt among the population. The people, who until then had been deceived by their leaders' promises and the false stability of the empire, now rise against those responsible for their downfall. This revolt is not organized, but is fueled by the frustration and despair of a population that finally understands it has been manipulated all along. The streets fill with protests and confrontations, and the social order that remained begins to disintegrate completely. What was once merely a political and institutional division now transforms into a civil war, where the people not only fight against the authorities, but also against each other. Anger and despair take over the nation, and the already weakened empire descends into a state of anarchy. Ezra's vision at this moment is marked by scenes of destruction and total chaos. The empire, which was once governed by a hierarchical and controlled structure, is now completely at the mercy of the popular uprising. The elites, exposed and unable to manipulate events any longer, try to flee or hide, but are pursued by those who had once believed in their lies. Violence spreads everywhere, and what remains of the empire's structure crumbles completely. There is no longer any control, and the deep state, which once operated in the shadows, is destroyed along with the old order. This fifth prophecy reveals that when the illusions sustaining an empire are shattered, revolt is inevitable. The population, which has been kept in ignorance for so long, now understands the extent of the manipulation it has been subjected to. And this revelation provokes a violent reaction, which destroys not only institutions but also the very foundations of society. The deep state, which has controlled events for so long, is finally destroyed. But the cost of this revelation is high. The empire not only falls but is entirely obliterated, leaving no chance for recovery. The sub-prophecies of this vision show that the truth, when finally revealed, can be devastating. The shattering of illusions and the unveiling of hidden forces provoke a chain reaction that leads to the total collapse of the empire. The popular uprising, though understandable, is unable to build something new from the ruins of the old empire, as it is fueled by anger and frustration. The end of illusions brings to light a dark truth. The empire, which seemed unshakable, was always at the mercy of forces that had never been in public view. And now, with everything exposed, there is no longer a way to rebuild what has been destroyed. Now that we have uncovered the hidden truth behind the fall of the empire, with the manipulative forces finally revealed and destroyed, it is time to act. Don't forget to grab your digital book by clicking the link in the first pinned comment. We have only a few units available, so secure yours now before it's gone. And get ready, because in the next prophecy, we will see how, even after total chaos, a new hope and leadership emerge from the ruins, bringing an unexpected rebirth, the awakening of a new hope. Amid chaos, Ezra's sixth prophecy reveals that, after the total collapse of the empire and the chaos that took over society, a new hope arises. Despite all the destruction, new voices begin to emerge among the people, offering a different vision that opposes the mistakes of the past. These new leaderships do not seek power for power's sake, but are focused on rebuilding amidst the ruins, something fairer, more balanced, and resilient. The ancient empire, symbolized by the great eagle, no longer exists. But there are those who, even in the midst of anarchy, begin to lay the foundations for a new era. The first sub-prophecy of this vision shows that even amidst chaos and revolt, new leaderships emerge among the people. These leaderships are not the result of a quest for power, but of a desperate need for reconstruction. Unlike the leaders of the past, who were corrupted by the desire for control and manipulation. These new leaders stand out for their direct connection with the people and their sincere desire to restore an order based on cooperation and justice. They are not centralized figures, but local leaders who rise up in various parts of the empire, offering practical and immediate solutions to the problems faced by their communities. This emergence of decentralized leadership is a direct contrast to the previous system, which was based on centralized and authoritarian control. In the second sub-prophecy, Ezra sees that these new leaderships begin to work directly in the ruins of the ancient empire. There is no longer a central structure that dictated the rules before, and now each community needs to organize for itself. The restart is not easy, as the scars of chaos and destruction are still very present. But the people, led by these new voices, begin to reorganize. Ezra observes that these new reconstruction attempts do not follow the same molds of the past. There is a greater focus on cooperation among people, on the redistribution of resources, and on establishing a more inclusive and transparent governance system. The lessons of the past, especially the mistakes that led to the collapse, are now used as guides to avoid following the same paths. The new communities that emerge from the ruins of the ancient empire are not interested in conquering the world or expanding uncontrollably. On the contrary, they are more focused on rebuilding a life that is sustainable, based on mutual respect and solidarity. Power, which was previously concentrated in a few hands, is now distributed more evenly, and cooperation becomes the key to the progress of these new societies. The third sub-prophecy reveals a deep and surprising phenomenon: the awakening of a new collective consciousness among the people. Ezra sees that after the collapse of the old system and the fall of the old leaderships, the people begin to realize that true strength lies in unity and working together. This new collective consciousness is not imposed by rulers, but emerges organically as people understand that survival depends on collaboration and mutual support. This revelation is a crucial point in Ezra's vision, as it shows that even after so much suffering and destruction, there is still hope for humanity. This new collective consciousness is marked by a fundamental change in how people perceive power and leadership. The authoritarian control and corruption that defined the ancient empire no longer have a place. The new leaderships emerging from this collective consciousness seek not to dominate or exploit, but to serve and assist in building a new society. This awakening brings a sense of renewal, where extreme individualism gives way to a more community-oriented and supportive vision. The focus shifts to the common good, and people begin to work together to rebuild what was destroyed. Therefore, this sixth prophecy shows us that even after the collapse of a great empire and the subsequent chaos, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. The new leaderships emerging among the people are different from the old ones, because they are focused on building a fairer and more balanced society. The new collective consciousness that arises reveals that the true strength of a nation lies not in the power of its elites, but in the unity and cooperation of its people. This new era that is beginning is not marked by ambition or the relentless pursuit of power, but by solidarity and justice. The sub-prophecies of this vision show that even in the most difficult situations, there is always space for hope and renewal. The ruins of the ancient empire become fertile ground for the emergence of new ideas and a new form of social organization. The fall of the eagle, which once seemed the end of everything, now reveals itself as the beginning of something new, where power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a few, but is distributed fairly and equitably. The new order that emerges is the result of unity and collaboration, and Ezra's vision reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, hope is never completely lost. The spiritual renaissance and the end of the era of darkness. In the seventh and final prophecy of Ezra, the focus shifts to the spiritual rebirth of humanity. After the collapse of the empire, internal struggles, and the rise of new leaderships, the people begin to seek a greater purpose for their existence. Ezra sees that, beyond material and political reconstruction, there is a profound need for spiritual transformation. This prophecy speaks of a new era in which the pursuit of power and domination will give way to wisdom, inner peace, and reconnection with true spiritual roots. The old era, marked by darkness and corruption, finally comes to an end, and a new light begins to shine over humanity. Ezra observes that the suffering and destruction experienced during the collapse of the empire provoke an unprecedented spiritual awakening. People, previously focused on material struggles and earthly ambitions, now begin to seek answers beyond the physical world. This spiritual awakening is not led by a single religion or doctrine, but emerges as a global movement where each individual begins to reconnect with their own spirituality. This transformation does not happen abruptly, but rather as a gradual process, where people start to realize that true strength comes from within and not from external power. The old structures of control and spiritual domination that previously served to manipulate the masses lose their power, and a new era of spiritual understanding begins. The second sub-prophecy reveals that, with spiritual awakening, comes the process of healing. The wounds left by the collapse of the empire, corruption, war, and destruction are not ignored, but faced consciously. People begin to acknowledge their past mistakes both individually and collectively, and seek ways of repair and reconciliation. Healing the wounds of the past is not just a physical matter, but also emotional and spiritual. Communities that were once divided by conflicts and resentments now begin to unite, driven by the desire to build a more harmonious future. This healing process is essential for the spiritual rebirth to be complete. For without facing what has been destroyed, it is impossible to build something truly new. The third sub-prophecy reveals that, with the advancement of spiritual awakening and the healing of wounds, the ancient era of darkness finally comes to an end. This era, marked by corruption, authoritarian control, and the relentless pursuit of power, is replaced by a new era where wisdom, mutual respect, and the quest for inner peace become the central values. Ezra sees that the darkness, which for so long dominated the hearts of people, now begins to fade away. The spiritual knowledge, once repressed and controlled, is now shared freely, and people begin to live their lives according to higher principles. This new era is not perfect, and challenges still exist, but the difference is that there is now a collective awareness that the true battle is not against external enemies, but against our own internal weaknesses. Pride, greed, and thirst for power are recognized as the true enemies of peace and harmony. With this new understanding, societies begin to thrive in a fairer and more balanced way, based on spiritual principles of cooperation and mutual respect. This seventh prophecy is the culmination of Ezra's vision. It shows that, despite all the suffering and destruction, there is still hope for humanity. Spiritual rebirth is the key to survival and future prosperity, and this rebirth is not something imposed from outside, but a transformation that happens within each individual. The new era that begins is an era of light, where knowledge, wisdom, and inner peace are valued above all. The ancient empire, with its thirst for power and control, no longer exists, and in its place arises a new civilization, wiser and more spiritually connected. This prophecy concludes Ezra's vision with a message of hope. It reminds us that, no matter how dark the darkness may be, there is always a light waiting to be rediscovered. Spiritual rebirth is the way for humanity to overcome its challenges and build a future where peace, justice, and love for one another are the central pillars. Now that we have reached the end of the seventh prophecy, I want to leave you with a challenge. What are you willing to do to contribute to this new era of light and wisdom that the prophecy reveals to us? Write your answer in the comments and share how you believe you can be part of this transformation. After all, we all have a role to play in this rebirth. Let's build this better future together. We have reached the end of the 7 prophecies, where we have witnessed the spiritual rebirth and the end of the age of darkness. Now, the choice is in your hands. Will you be part of this new era of light and wisdom? Don't forget to share your answer in the comments. Also, feel free to watch the 2 recommended videos on screen, which will help you deepen your knowledge about the future and the mysteries of life. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with those who also need to know these revelations. Let's build a better path together.